There is a moment in The Love Prescription when two exhausted, fastidious people stand in their own backyard in old clothes, staring at a pile of wet garden muck, waiting for one of them to throw the first handful. Mark and Annette had already decided to separate. They had been married more than a decade, they had an 8-year-old daughter, and their marriage had gone flat in the specific way that marriages go flat. No fighting worth the name, just a slow waning of attraction and interest and companionship until they felt less like lovers than like business partners sharing a mortgage. Their therapist, in what they were privately certain was the final proof of his incompetence, had assigned them a mud fight. Their daughter, who had been listening in, refused to let them drop it. And so they went outside, and Annette flicked a spatter of cold mud onto Mark's cheek, and within minutes they were howling, sliding, filthy, and holding on to each other. That single afternoon turned their marriage around. This is the book John Gottman and Julie Gottman built out of 50 years of watching couples under laboratory conditions. And the mud fight is not a charming anecdote dropped in for color. It is the thesis in miniature. The Love Prescription, 7 Days to More Intimacy, Connection and Joy, is a compressed, deliberately small book with a large claim behind it. Love is not a feeling that happens to you, but a practice you perform, and the practice is made almost entirely of tiny actions repeated daily rather than grand gestures performed rarely. The authors compare Mark and Annette's afternoon to a single rock falling into a river midstream. The water courses higher around it, carves a new line into the bank, and over enough time cuts an entirely new valley. Small things often. That phrase is the motto of the book and the whole of its prescription. What follows is a summary of that book, structured the way the Gottmans structured it. An introduction, a set of practical preliminaries, 7 days of habits, and a conclusion that asks the reader to keep going. The author's authority rests on an unusually specific evidentiary base, which they lay out early and return to constantly, and this summary keeps that evidence in view, because in this book, the advice and the data are inseparable. Strip out the studies, and you have a pamphlet of pleasant suggestions. Keep them in, and you have something closer to a clinical protocol. Small things often. The introduction. The Gottmans open by taking the poets seriously and then declining to join them. Love has been called a red, red rose by Burns and an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests by Shakespeare. The movies have called it a many-splendid thing and the state of never having to say you're sorry. The author's question is whether something so vast and individual can nevertheless have a formula, and their answer is a flat yes, with the immediate qualification that the formula is a small one. Tiny doses, daily. Their reasoning is that this is simply what a relationship structurally is. Not one big thing, but a million small things, every day, for a lifetime. The credentials behind the claim are laid out with some care. John Gottman began not as a psychologist, but as a mathematician. He was doing graduate work at MIT when he found himself more absorbed in his roommate's psychology books than in his own, and switched fields. 2 decades into researching relationships, the mathematics resurfaced as a question. Mathematical biologists had modeled pandemics, tumor formation, even why tigers have stripes and leopards have spots. Why not love? The Love Lab was founded in Seattle in 1990 to answer it. The authors describe having studied more than 3,000 couples there, following some for as long as 20 years, and having separately studied more than 40,000 couples on the verge of entering couples therapy. They measured body language, conversational patterns, conflict behavior, personal histories, heart rates, and stress hormones in the bloodstream, and reviewed footage down to the 100th of a second. The stated payoff is the book's most quoted statistic. After 15 minutes of observation, they claim 90% accuracy in predicting whether a couple will stay together and whether the union will be a happy one. One of the more disarming admissions in the introduction is how wrong Gottman was at the outset. Tracking his own theories against his results over time, he found that 60% of his earliest ideas about what makes marriages succeed or fail were off base. He attributes this to the same source that misleads everyone else: cultural stereotypes absorbed from novels, television, film, and one's own family, and treats it as the argument for data rather than intuition. It is a notable rhetorical move. The authors establish credibility partly by cataloguing their own early failure rate. From the aggregated data, the authors extract three universal factors. First, couples must stay curious about each other because people grow and change. Successful couples make and continually expand their love maps, meaning their working knowledge of each other's inner worlds, which requires not only asking questions, but asking the right kind. Second, couples must share fondness and admiration, noticing what a partner does well, identifying what is admirable in who they are, and saying it out loud. The authors are emphatic that partners routinely assume this is understood without being spoken, and are routinely wrong. Loving words are not the occasional drink of water given to a potted plant, but the continuous oxygen it breathes. Third, couples turn toward rather than away, meaning they notice and respond to what the authors call bids for connection. The introduction closes by naming what is conspicuously missing from that list: conflict. The authors are careful not to say problems should be ignored. Their claim is narrower and more counterintuitive. That conflict is the wrong place to begin. The best relationships, they argue from the lab data, are not built on partners mostly telling each other what is wrong. They are built on partners mostly telling each other what is right. Hence the instruction that would otherwise sound frivolous. Before you sit down at the table to work on communication skills and big issues, go make a mud pit. How to use this book, the preliminaries. Before the 7 days begin, the authors clear away 4 objections, and the section functions as a compressed argument about when intervention is appropriate. To the reader who worries it is too soon, a new relationship, nothing wrong yet, the answer is that there is no such thing as too soon. The supporting observation is that most couples wait an average of 4 to 6 years before seeking help, by which point the author's repeated internal refrain is, "If only we'd gotten to you earlier." They press the point with an analogy about proactivity in every other domain of life. We eat well and exercise before our bodies fail. We take cars in for tune-ups before they break down. The misconception is that a relationship warrants attention only once it is in trouble. To the reader who fears it is too late, the authors report that in all their years of research and clinical practice, it has been very rare to encounter couples for whom it genuinely was. They add an important caveat to their own famous prediction rate. The 90% figure is not written in stone because they cannot literally see the future. They are making a best guess from observed patterns, and when people change unhealthy patterns for healthy ones, they change the prediction. They also report a finding that runs against intuition. The couples who are most unhappy at the start of an intervention are not the ones who benefit least. Their research, and others in the field, indicates that the most distressed couples make the largest gains. To the reader whose partner is unenthusiastic, the advice is practical and slightly mischievous. Share the most interesting findings from each chapter, and the authors offer a sample line about couples who cuddle having the most sex as a reliable attention getter. The 4th objection, "Can a week really matter?" receives the section's most substantive answer, and it is an experiment. Working with Reader's Digest and the writer Joan DeClaire, the authors brought couples in for the full relationship assessment they gave everyone, then sent them out to lunch. While the couples ate, the staff pored over the questionnaire data and selected a single intervention that could be delivered in 1 hour. For instance, training a partner to express needs positively rather than critically. They administered that one intervention and then waited 2 years. DeClaire's follow-up found what the authors describe as a staggering success rate. By and large, the couples had changed their dynamic, and the change had held. The finding they draw from it is not that any single trick works, but that one shift in how a couple interacts can propagate through an entire relationship. Finally, the authors dispatch the question of whether love alone is sufficient with a one-word answer. No. Their reasoning is that couples stop courting each other, stop prioritizing romance and adventure and sex, and let life fill the space. They cite a study of 30 dual-career couples by the Sloan Center for Working Families at UCLA, which found relationships collapsing into endless to-do lists, with conversation constrained to errands and planning. The conclusion is that the qualities that make a relationship worth having must be practiced intentionally, which is what the following week is designed to teach. Day 1. Make contact. The first day is built on what the authors call the most foundational discovery of the Love Lab, and it arrives through Allison and Jeremy, a couple who enrolled in a Zoom couples retreat 9 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, looking, as the authors put it, exhausted. They had young children, were working from home while supervising remote learning, and were sitting side by side on camera while appearing to be miles apart. Everything had become a disagreement: how to handle a kid refusing vegetables, how much pandemic risk to accept, whether to see friends outdoors, whether the children should mask on a neighborhood bike ride. And life kept interrupting before anything resolved, leaving both of them ruminating. The thoughts they reported having about each other are the diagnostic detail. He never really considers my opinion. He just looks for reasons I'm wrong. She always has to win. Asked to describe when, in a typical day, they had an opportunity to connect, not to problem solve, but to talk and listen, they blinked and said they had none. The concept the authors introduce here is the bid for connection, and their definition is deliberately expansive. A bid can be a casual remark, one person sitting down beside another, or something as subtle as a sigh. It is an invitation. What matters is the response, and the lab's coding scheme sorts responses into exactly 3 categories. Turning toward is any positive or affirmative acknowledgement. The authors note that even a distracted counts. Turning away is the absence of response, whether from active avoidance or simple failure to notice. Turning against is an irritable or angry response that shuts the attempt down. The book illustrates each with the same scenario run 3 ways. A partner scrolling remarks that an article is interesting, and the reply is either, "Oh yeah? What's it about?" or continued typing with eyes on the screen, or "Be quiet. Can't you see I'm trying to work?" They then run a subtler case. A deep, audible sigh at dinner is itself the bid, and the responses range from, "Hey honey, is something the matter?" to a silently turned newspaper page, to "What's the matter now?" The data behind this comes from the first big Love Lab study. 130 newlywed couples, one at a time, in an apartment lab on the shores of Mont Lake near the University of Washington. Julie Gottman designed it to feel like a home rather than a laboratory. Paintings, comfortable furniture, throws, a stocked kitchen, music, television, picture windows on the lake. With 3 wall-mounted cameras, that being the number they had determined was required to cover the space with no blind spots. Couples were given no instructions whatsoever. They watched their shows, read the paper, cooked, cleaned, talked and fought, and every behavior was recorded and coded. The authors are candid that they did not know in advance what they were looking for. 6 years later, the coded behavior yielded the number the chapter turns on. Couples who divorced had turned toward their partner's bids 33% of the time. Couples who stayed together had turned toward 86% of the time. The authors describe it as a statistical gap one rarely sees in scientific research, and identify it as the single biggest predictor of happiness and stability they found. A second experiment establishes why the first day of their own workshop is friendship rather than conflict. The Gottmans run a 2-day couples workshop in which day 1 addresses friendship and intimacy, and day 2 addresses conflict. They split participants into a group doing only day 1, a group doing only day 2, and a group doing both, and recontacted everyone a year later. The both days group retained the most change, which surprised no one. The finding that mattered was that the day 1 only group also did well, while the conflict-only group fared the worst of the 3. The authors explain the mechanism physiologically. As tension rises, the body responds, people become flooded and revert to habitual coping. And they illustrate it with themselves, John having to fight an immediate defensive reflex, and Julie's first instinct under heat being to run out the door and into the nearest forest. Changing behavior during conflict is extremely hard. Changing behavior in the small daily moments is much easier, and it improves conflict downstream. More turning toward produces better conflict management, more shared humor mid-argument, more capacity to pause and make a peace offering, and more likelihood the repair attempt is received. The governing metaphor is the emotional bank account. Every act of turning toward, even returning a smile with a smile, is a coin dropped in. John illustrates the payoff with an unusually vivid confession about grudge building, which he describes as a craft. You cut the rough materials of your life down to size, bang them together, shape the thing, and sit on it. In a relationship with enough turning toward, he found he simply could not complete the construction. An annoying voice kept interrupting, with the tea she brought when he was sick, the laugh at his joke that morning, the lunch she made despite being busy. The deposits offset the withdrawals until the grudge cannot grow. That chapter's control group produces a closing surprise the authors present as a mistake. In the workshop study, the control group received no workshop at all. Only a copy of the 7 principles for making marriage work, and access to 7 hours of phone time with a licensed therapist. None of them ever contacted the therapist. They only read the book, and they did remarkably well, finishing second only to the both days group and beating every other condition, with gains still present a year later. The prescribed practice for the day is a 10-minute check-in, built around a single question. Is there anything you need from me today? Supplemented by an exercise the authors call picking up the pennies, which asks the reader to treat every fleeting bid as money lying on the sidewalk. Their troubleshooting is notably practical. When you cannot engage with a bid, say so, and ask to be reminded later rather than ignoring it. And when a bid arrives wrapped in negativity, it wouldn't occur to you to make dinner tonight for once, would it? Respond to the bid underneath rather than the packaging. Day 2. Ask a big question. The second day concerns curiosity, and the authors ground it in their own origin story. Both had moved to Seattle within 2 months of each other, John relocating west after 2 decades teaching in the Midwest, Julie returning to the Pacific Northwest after 2 decades away. They met in a coffee shop they both frequented. She noticed him looking smart and professorial. He noticed her confidence and poise. And the conversation, in their telling, has not really stopped since. Their point is about what early conversations consist of. Exploratory, open-ended questions asked effortlessly, because both parties are acutely aware of how much they do not yet know. The failure mode is the drift from big questions to logistical ones, from "Do you see yourself having kids?" and "If you could live anywhere, where would you live?" to "Did you take out the garbage?" and "Is it time to schedule the kids' doctor appointments?" The authors are careful not to pretend logistics are optional. Their claim is that people are not movies. A film watched twice unfolds identically. A person asked the same question at 2 points in life gives 2 different answers, because desires morph, goals shift, and bucket lists evolve. Continuing to assume the old answers still hold is the setup for a surprise. 3 couples carry the chapter. David and Gwen had been married 20 years, and by external measures had everything. A fulfilling, high-powered career for him, 3 children, a large and beautiful home, financial security from his salary, and her inherited wealth. They arrived presenting a sexless marriage, and the authors quickly identified sex as symptom rather than cause. 15 years earlier, at the birth of their first child, they had turned their attention from each other onto logistics and parenthood, and had simply never swiveled back. They asked whether it was the right preschool, whether the plumber had been called, who was collecting the children on Friday. They never asked whether this was still the life either of them wanted. The authors note the almost literal architecture of the problem. The house was large enough that the 2 could move room to room and rarely collide. And they formulate the intervention as a change of question. The first step was not to ask each other, "How are you?" but "Who are you?" Brianna and Tyler are the counter case, a couple in a small 2-bedroom apartment with a baby, daycare closed, both working full-time from home and trading childcare, whose relationship nonetheless held. The authors list the things each appreciated. He handled childcare and the endless laundry. She kept the schedules and cooked inventively, but land on the thing they actually observed. The 2 were simply interested in each other. The emblem is a walk in rural Maine during a rare pandemic date, when Tyler gestured at a field and mentioned in passing that this was where Kevin, his sheep, had lived. Brianna's reaction, that after all these years she was only now learning he had owned a sheep named Kevin, opened hours of conversation in the cold about the lives they had each imagined as teenagers and how those imagined lives compared with the real one. Her summary is the chapter's most quotable line of ordinary wisdom. It was when she realized he would never stop surprising her. The technical term the authors are building toward is the love map, an intimate working knowledge of a partner's inner world, their hopes and dreams, beliefs, fears and desires. The critical distinction is that maps must be not only created but updated, which requires open-ended questions. A big question, in their definition, is one with no yes/no reply available and no drop-down menu of expected answers. They observe dryly that the only correct answer to "Did you pay the electrical bill?" is "Yes, honey." An open-ended question is full of possibility precisely because neither party knows where it ends. They also insist these cannot be reserved for date night. They must be a daily habit rather than a special occasion. The chapter's centerpiece is a fight of the author's own, which they present as the origin of one of the Gottman Institute's most powerful interventions. About 4 years into their marriage, they had begun renting on one of the San Juan Islands, and Julie announced she wanted to buy a cabin there. John's response was an immediate and absolute no. They fought in circles about affordability and practicality until John sought a therapist. Choosing one, he admits, was a bad reason, because he sensed she would take his side. She did, and disastrously. Her advice was that he need not cave, that he should tell Julie how it was going to be, and she would adapt. John was horrified by the rigidity of it, asked Julie on the way out whether he sounded like that, and was told yes. What broke the deadlock was asking each other why. Julie described growing up in Portland blocks from the largest wild municipal park in the country, where she had gone to daydream and run and escape a tense home, sometimes sneaking out at night to sleep among the trees. The smell of wet soil and crushed evergreen was to her the smell of safety. John had grown up in Brooklyn, where nature was something you visited briefly and then wiped off. But the deeper source was his parents, who had fled Vienna, his father a rabbi studying medicine, losing their apartment, furniture, clothes, photographs, and family heirlooms, escaping over the Alps into Switzerland with a cube of sugar and a lemon in their pockets, and arriving in the Dominican Republic, where John was born, with nothing. His father's refrain was that nothing is permanent, and John's inherited conviction was that you invest in education, which cannot be taken from you, rather than in property. Nothing about the finances changed after that conversation, but the compromise did. John would support the cabin if Julie kept a kosher kitchen, with the option to sell in 2 years if he still felt the same. They did not sell it. They now live on the island most of the year. The generalizable finding is what they call the dreams within conflict exercise. The proposition that most fights are not about their apparent subject, but about something beneath the stated positions, and that gridlocked problems usually conceal an unrealized or even unacknowledged life dream. The questions that unlock it are what is your dream about this issue, and what is your nightmare? Taken into the lab and the workshops, the approach produced major breakthroughs 87% of the time, including with severely distressed couples and with some who had already divorced and were trying again. The conclusion the authors draw is that conflict is rarely ultimately about personality or dish duty or money. It is about dreams, values, meaning, history, and even multi-generational history. A last small story makes the point about how much remains undiscovered. William and Marianne, longtime Orcas Island residents who built their own house and pride themselves on repairing rather than replacing, had worked around a broken oven for 15 years. During the pandemic, Marianne asked William what he would like to be doing, and he said he would love to bake, and could they fix the oven? She was startled. He had never shown the slightest interest. It was an easy repair. He turned out to be an excellent baker, and out of the loaves and cakes came a stream of childhood memories she had never heard, including a long-held fantasy of opening a bakery. The instruction that follows is to become a topographer of a landscape you only think you know, and John describes still running this inventory on Julie daily after 34 years. What is on her mind? What is she worried about? What is she looking forward to? What do I know and what do I not know? In other words, what am I missing? Day 3. Say thank you. The third day opens on a claim about universality. Every couple the authors see is a genuinely singular combination of histories, personalities, desires, and communication styles, pressed on by external forces, financial pressure, work and family demands, discrimination. But across all that variation, one overlap holds. Everyone wants to be appreciated, acknowledged for their effort, and seen. Noah and Melissa arrive as the case study. In their late 30s, they had spent 10 years working 100-hour weeks building and running their own company, built a house, had a baby, and were awaiting an adoption. Wanting to slow down, they had sold the company and the house, and then immediately launched into renovating the new place while Melissa started writing a book. What the authors observed was a couple immersed in an endlessly replenishing to-do list, each convinced they were shouldering it alone, each seeing chiefly what the other had not done. The unpaid bills, the unfinished bathroom wiring, the doctor's appointments and shoes and diapers. Melissa's mode was matter-of-fact analytical cataloguing of Noah's failures. Noah's was explosive defensiveness. Each response fed the other. The authors then do something useful. They narrate the field's own wrong turn. Couples therapists once assumed unhappy couples were simply not being nice enough to each other, and prescribed positivity days on which partners were assigned extra acts of kindness and service. It did not work, and was abandoned. The reason it did not work is the chapter's central finding. People generally were being kind. Their partners just weren't seeing it. The evidence is a 1980 study by Elizabeth Robinson and Gail Price, who placed 2 observers in couples' homes, one assigned to each spouse, tasked with objectively recording positive things partners did for each other, while the spouses themselves were trained to record pleasing and displeasing behaviors on a spouse observation checklist. Unhappily married couples missed 50% of the positive things their partners did. The happily married couples were not performing more kindnesses. They were simply better at perceiving them. 2 mechanisms are offered. The first is evolutionary and attentional. The brain scans for problems by default because solving problems aided survival. So negatives leap out like a neon sign, and the attention and processing networks filter incoming experience through existing assumptions, guaranteeing that a person looking for problems finds them. The second is a named clinical concept, negative sentiment override, coined by psychologist Robert Weiss, describing the state in which negative feeling about a relationship becomes strong and habitual enough to recolor positive moments as they are actually occurring. The authors break the pattern into 3 recognizable behaviors: cataloging everything a partner does wrong and withholding the benefit of the doubt, seeing lunch dishes in the sink and concluding he doesn't care about our home rather than he had back-to-back meetings, refusing to state needs on the theory that they should be obvious, and asking for help, but then criticizing the execution, which produces a partner who does not want to do the task at all because he resents being controlled. The reversal is illustrated by Joel and David, a couple locked in mutual disappointment, each feeling he could never do enough, each keeping a private ledger of small grievances. They arrived one week visibly different, warmer, sitting closer, relaxed, and the explanation was a thank you for coffee. Joel had for years risen early and left a full carafe for David, a night owl, so that hot coffee waited when he woke. It had faded into the background until Joel traveled for a week, and David woke to a silent kitchen and a cold pot, ground his own beans, fumbled with an unfamiliar machine, and realized how much he had been quietly depending on. David's own account of what changed is the chapter's most useful sentence. Once he started looking for what Joel was doing right, it was everywhere, and while the problems remained, they no longer made a dent. The neuroscience is supplied by Richard Davidson of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, whose EEG work the authors summarize as showing that positivity is visible on a scan. Asked to describe a typical day, depressed subjects show greater activity in the frontal right side, which processes fear, sadness, and disgust, emotions that drive withdrawal, while the frontal left is associated with approach emotions like love, interest, and curiosity. The authors flag the counterintuitive inclusion in that list. Anger is an approach emotion, engaging rather than withdrawing. Davidson also found that mindfulness meditation, returning attention to the present whenever it wanders, can reverse an entrenched negative habit of mind, first within sessions and eventually more durably. Neuroplasticity is the operative concept. Scanning for the positive is trainable, and the training changes function at the cellular level. The chapter's most striking evidence comes from a study the authors ran on couples experiencing domestic violence, and they are careful to define their terms. Not severe violence with a victim-perpetrator dynamic, but mild to moderate violence in which both partners may become violent during escalated conflict, no injuries are inflicted, and both want to change. The population was couples in poverty caught in that cycle. The intervention paired positivity training with self-soothing, using a biofeedback device called the M-Wave, made by HeartMath, which measured heart rate variability and displayed colored zones. Red indicated high arousal, emotional flooding, and vulnerability to violent outburst. Participants moved to green by slowing their breathing, extending the exhale beyond the inhale, and holding in mind something in their life they felt affection or gratitude toward. Meeting twice weekly with facilitators for 5-minute sessions across a 20-week study, the couples showed diminished hostility, improved friendship, and greater passion and romance, with results holding a year and a half later. The author's summary is that violence was eliminated and physiology during conflict was changed such that people could disagree calmly. Applied to Noah and Melissa, the intervention had 2 steps. First, a moratorium on criticism. 0 critical comments permitted, with the instruction that the brain would continue generating negatives and the discipline lay in letting them fall away unsaid, like sand. Second, an assignment to spy. Watch the other person all day and notice what they are doing right, without commentary. Melissa discovered how much Noah was carrying, the daily bath he gave their daughter and how well he handled her, the extra errands and housework that bought her writing time, the encouragement he had been giving her about a book project that was making her anxious. She reported feeling her own load lighten despite an unchanged to-do list. Thanks came naturally once she was seeing, and Noah's defensiveness dissolved. The authors describe the reversal as an updraft. The chapter closes by naming the enemies. The 4 horsemen, criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling, are the relationship breakers that arrive when a culture of appreciation is absent, and the countermeasure is to make the invisible visible. Find the good that has been overlooked, notice it, and say it aloud rather than assuming it is known. Tony and Sunny illustrate the stakes under external pressure. A couple whose energy was consumed by a toxic co-parenting relationship with Tony's ex-wife until they were criticizing each other constantly and asking what the point of the relationship was. The intervention accepted the external stress as fixed and redirected effort inward. Tony's assignment was to make Sunny's week positive, Sunny's to appreciate Tony's efforts. The authors are notably modest about their own contribution here, saying they were able to help only minimally in session, and that the couple did the work themselves at home. Day 4. Give a real compliment. Day 4 distinguishes gratitude, which was yesterday's subject, from admiration, which is today's. Gratitude is for what a partner does. Admiration is for who a partner is, their personality and innate qualities, from the superficial, like their eyes, down to the deep, like their spirituality, optimism, or capacity for love. Molly and Caroline supply the case. They met fresh out of college on a U.S. Forest Service trail crew through AmeriCorps, hauling tools into the North Cascades to clear fallen trees and rebuild trail, sleeping out under the stars and falling into a conversation one working day that started light and turned deep. 10 years on, they are married and working in environmental activism in Seattle, in a craftsman house with a garden built from cedar planks in what was once the front lawn. The pressure is money and direction. The city has grown expensive, they no longer travel, and children would be costly. Molly wants to leave for somewhere cheaper and wilder. Caroline likes the house, the garden, the job, and the life. In session, every topic detonated. When Molly raised having a baby, Caroline told her she was just restless and always chasing the next thing, and asked why what they had could not be enough. Molly countered that they had agreed on children, and that Caroline could not drag her feet and expect her to wait. The authors then apply what they call one of the clearest litmus tests of any relationship. Tell us how you met. Both told it vividly, the uncomfortable rocky ground, holding hands secretly in the dark from separate sleeping bags, and both answered the follow-up without hesitation. Caroline had fallen for Molly's boldness, always at the front of the group, taking the hardest tasks, up for anything. Molly had fallen for Caroline's listening and thoughtfulness, her patience and steadiness, which she describes as landing on solid ground after being at sea. Because those feelings were accessible and specific, the authors report knowing the couple would be fine. That confidence is not a hunch, but a finding from the 3,000 Love Lab couples. Couples who stay happily together can readily name specific qualities they love in their partner, retain vivid memories of their shared past, and narrate that history in an overwhelmingly positive register, emphasizing the good times. The authors pair this with a claim that reframes the whole enterprise. The majority of problems couples face are perpetual problems, not solvable and not fixable. What distinguishes the couples who last is not resolution, but the daily practice of holding in mind what they admire about the person they chose. Admiration, they insist, is not something that happens, but something you do. Like air in a life raft, keeping you above waves that do not stop coming. The chapter's cardinal statistic is the ratio, 5-1. That is the minimum proportion of positive to negative interactions required during conflict for love to survive over time. It came from an early longitudinal study in which couples were made comfortable and given 15 minutes to resolve a disagreement while being recorded. The transcripts were later coded moment by moment, with smiles, small jokes, touching a hand, expressions of empathy and interest, saying "I understand," nodding, and kindness scored positive, and nasty remarks, raised voices, snapping, criticism, blame, and disinterest scored negative. 6 years later, the couples still happily together were the ones who had maintained at least 5-1. The authors underline that these couples were not perfect and that negativity during conflict is inevitable and human. The point is the ratio, because negativity has far more power to damage than positivity has to heal. Then comes the caveat that gives the chapter its force. 5-1 is the conflict ratio. Outside conflict, in ordinary daily life, cooking, negotiating chores, parenting, chatting about the day, the required minimum is 20-1. The masters maintained that, or better. Couples heading for divorce or unhappiness showed the number sliding toward the negative side. The mechanism by which people fail this test, without noticing, is explored through the talk table, an apparatus John built with Robert Levinson, his first research partner, before the Seattle Love Lab existed. It was an angled table with 2 rows of 5 buttons on each side, running from positive through neutral to negative. 1 row for intent, 1 for impact. Couples were prompted to work on a continuing disagreement and took turns speaking, with a light indicating whose turn it was. At each handoff, the speaker recorded how they had intended to come across, while the listener recorded how the remark had actually landed. To sharpen the comparison, the authors oversampled from the extremes, recruiting only couples who were either very happy or very unhappy. The result was blunt. Intentions made no difference. Everyone had positive intentions, including people whose behavior was angry and hostile. Impact was everything, and the difference between the extremely unhappy and the very happy reduced to kindness of speech. Happy couples treated each other more gently, without criticism, contempt, or sarcasm. With a dose-response relationship, meaning more kindness produced better outcomes. The authors take a moment here to correct Tolstoy, who wrote that all happy families are alike, while every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Not scientifically true, they say. Successful couples ranged from highly emotional and volatile to poker-faced and severe in the manner of American Gothic. The only invariant was the ratio. They then replicated the study in a different population. The first sample had been college and graduate students, so they repeated it in a rural community in southern Indiana, and found the margin of error only in the second decimal place. The chapter's most personal material concerns what to do about the qualities in a partner that are not admirable. The authors explicitly reject the phrase rose-colored glasses, saying they never use it because it implies a false or deceptive spin. What they mean instead is seeing a partner fully, leaning into the good qualities while extending compassion toward what Thomas Bradbury, a psychologist and researcher at UCLA, termed enduring vulnerabilities, the particular sensitivities accumulated over a lifetime, often reaching back to childhood, which are frequently the root of the traits a partner finds hardest to live with, such as insecurity, fear, quickness to anger, or tuning out. Their own illustration is small and exact. Driving home, John wondered whether the plumber had been paid, a matter of some conscience for him, since tradespeople depend on that income, and asked Julie at the door. Her anger startled him. She shot back, "Did you pay the plumber?" and left the room. His private thought was that he had married a lunatic. Rather than stew, he went and talked, and Julie described coming home from school as a child to a mother whose first words were always critical before they were ever a greeting. "Is that what you wore to school? Where's your purse? Did you forget it again?" Her request was simply that when they had not seen each other all day, he say hello first, something kind, or a question about her day. The fix was easy once understood, and the authors report that the first time John sees Julie after any absence, he shows that he is glad she exists. The chapter's warning is about what happens when this practice lapses. Memories themselves become corrupted, like a virus in a computer file. Contempt, which they identify as the #1 predictor of divorce, as damaging to both partners' mental health and as associated with elevated rates of colds, flus, and other infections in the year following, infects the foundational code. In the relationships the authors describe as genuinely unsalvageable, partners reaching back into their shared past can no longer retrieve what they once loved and admired. That is the argument for the daily micro-habit. A relationship is a fire that must be tended with kindling and breath, not left alone and hoped for. Day 5. Ask for what you need. Day 5 begins with an argument reconstructed twice, which is the chapter's method. Jake and Miriam have not eaten dinner together in weeks. She is an artist working toward a gallery show at the university where she teaches. He has left a firm that consumed his time to launch his own land use practice from the living room, which he loves, but which has become lonely. When she arrives home late again, he tells her she could have taken an hour off for once, that he had been looking forward to it, that he had bought her favorite steamed clams. She is genuinely surprised. She had no idea. He protests that he asked her yesterday and she said yes. She replies that of course she wanted to, that she had hoped to get enough done, that she is not ready for the opening and thought he understood. He answers that if he invites her to dinner once in a month, he assumed she would make it happen. If the relationship still matters to her, she asks where on earth this is coming from. The authors then rewind to the previous day and replay the exchange that Jake believed was an invitation. Miriam is packing a bag for a long day. Jake is talking about the new firm, going well, and mentions that he misses the dinners they used to have at restaurants around the city after work. How good it felt to walk into a crowded bar and find her waiting with 2 glasses of wine. It would be nice to do that again, he says. Definitely, she replies. Maybe we could do something tomorrow night, he says. We could stay in, I'll cook. Sure, maybe, she says. Text me later, I have to run. She kisses him and is gone. The diagnosis is that they were having 2 separate conversations. Jake believed he had expressed himself. He had in fact dropped hints. His actual request was off the cuff and casual, and he heard her sure without hearing her maybe. Miriam never registered that anything was being asked of her, and when she failed to fulfill it, she was surprised to be blamed for missing an appointment she had never made. The author's line is one they say every couple knows and no couple acts on. Your partner is not a mind reader. The chapter's most substantial section explains why direct asking is so difficult, and the explanation is social before it is psychological. We have been taught that needs are a weakness and conditioned not to acknowledge them, let alone announce them. Women are taught not to be too needy. Men are taught to be tough and strong and to have no needs at all. Both messages are rooted in inherited scripts about what is attractive, acceptable, feminine and masculine, and the authors treat them as the cultural water we swim in, absorbed regardless of how vigorously one pushes back. They add a second, individual layer. Many people, whatever their gender, had needs or requests ignored early in life, which ingrains a belief that one's needs are neither important nor valid. The result is a population moving through life with subterranean desires, suppressing rather than expressing, and the suppressed material does not stay down. It shapes emotion, constrains thinking, and eventually flares into resentment and argument, as it did for Jake. There is also simple fear. Asking exposes you to refusal, and being shot down is humiliating enough that people will avoid asking for even simple things. An hour of your evening, dinner tonight, preferring to hint and maneuver in the hope that a partner will intuit the desire and spare them the exposure. The author's counter is direct. Needs are normal, healthy and human, as natural as breathing, and as essential as food, water and air. They then dismantle the distinction people use to police themselves. Asked whether something is a want or a need, their answer is that it does not matter. Wants have been coded as greedy or selfish, and the authors reject that, describing wants and needs as a continuous spectrum. Like colors across the light spectrum, all of them valid and all of them properly expressed to a partner. The chapter's technical contribution is a template with 3 steps. First, describe yourself, not your partner. Do not open by talking about them at all. Second, describe the situation you are upset about rather than your partner's personality flaws, so they can help improve conditions instead of defending themselves. Third, state a positive need, specific, clear, and framed as an opportunity for the partner to do something right, rather than a report on what they have done wrong. The author's phrase for this is telling your partner how to shine for you. The worked examples are unglamorous and exact. Instead of, "You never make time for me anymore," obviously you couldn't care less about our relationship. The reformulation is, "I feel lonely when we go this long without spending real time together. Can we find some time to just be together?" Instead of, "You always leave the kitchen such a mess, what a slob you are," it is, "I feel overwhelmed lately by all there is to do around the house. Could you take over the dishes or the laundry this week?" Along the way, they define criticism precisely. It is aiming at who a person fundamentally is, rather than distinguishing person from action. "I wish you wouldn't leave your socks on the living room floor" is a complaint. "You are such a slob, you always leave your stuff everywhere, you never help me clean up" is criticism. They flag always and never as criticisms even without an explicit insult attached, on the grounds that both words imply a defect of character. They also name the failure mode of stored-up grievance, sandbagging, in which resentments accumulate until a trivial jostle brings the whole reservoir down and a minor disagreement becomes total war, delivered as an ambush that arrives all at once. And they take an unusually firm line on a common phrase. Constructive criticism is a myth. There is no such thing. Criticism is always destructive. The supporting data is a striking prediction claim. Watching how a couple begins a conversation, the authors say the outcome of the discussion and of the relationship 6 years later can be predicted 96% of the time from the first 3 minutes. The operative distinction is between a harsh startup, which opens with criticism or an always/never statement, and what they call a softened startup, which begins without criticism and with compassion, taking into account what a partner needs to hear in order to actually listen. Jake's story resolves through a piece of history. Miriam learned that he had been hesitant to ask her directly to take time off work because of a long record of being let down. His father routinely chose work over Jake's events, even after promising, even after being begged, and every no-show landed as a crushing disappointment until Jake stopped putting himself out there at all. If he did not ask, he could not be refused, and could not learn again that he was a low priority for someone he loved. He felt let down anyway, without ever having given Miriam the chance to show up. Once she understood what was at stake, rearranging a couple of evenings a week during the run-up to a gallery opening turned out not to be hard. The chapter's closing tool addresses timing, and its data is sobering. Over a typical day, busy couples have limited overlap, and the odds that both partners are in a receptive state simultaneously are low. Even when people turn toward bid 60% of the time, the probability that both are turning toward at once is only 36%. Worse, even among happily married Love Lab couples, a person whose bid went unnoticed or unanswered would rebid only 22% of the time. The solution comes from Rachel and Jason, together 27 years with 2 teenage daughters, he a morning person and she a night owl, whose scarce overlapping time was consumed by logistics, who is going to the grocery store, who is picking up the kids, leaving spats and lingering hurt feelings whenever one needed to talk, and the other was in work mode or parent mode or simply spent. Dropping her daughter at a Montessori school, Rachel overheard a teacher instructing children that if they wanted to talk to a friend who was busy playing, they should first ask, "Are you available?" The friend could then say yes or no, or "after I finish this drawing." The children actually did it. Rachel and Jason adopted the rule wholesale, and both report the same effect. It removed guilt from saying, "in 10 minutes." It removed pressure from the asker, And it meant that when engagement did come, it came with full attention. Day 6. Reach out and touch. Day 6 approaches sex by declining to approach it directly. Grace and Andrew present with a sex life at an all-time low and no obvious cause. They were not fighting, they got along, they were busy, but so is everyone. He worked in technology at a nearby military base and enjoyed answering the question about his job with, "It's classified." She was home with 3 young children, plus chickens and ducks and hopes of goats, running painting projects and guitar lessons and cooking classes through a house they both describe as colorful chaos. They had weathered droughts after each birth and always recovered, but their youngest was nearly 3. Everyone was sleeping through the night, and the season of sex had not returned. Their attempts, a date, a scheduled rendezvous, felt forced, and half the time they simply fell asleep. Andrew describes deciding at breakfast that tonight is definitely happening and then losing to toothbrushing. Grace describes getting into bed and finding it strange to start making out with someone whose hand she has not held all day and with whom she has not had a conversation, so she raises a topic and the evening goes elsewhere. Alicia and Abdul, lawyers for area tech companies living downtown, childless by choice and passionate about biking and travel, arrive at the identical impasse from the opposite direction. Lockdown gave them more time together and left them feeling like roommates, exhausted by their own cooking and having burned through every prestige series on every streaming service. To answer whether this is normal, the authors turn to Chrisanna Northrup, whose book, The Normal Bar, grew out of exactly this situation in her own 15-year marriage. Northrup enlisted 2 prominent American sociologists, Pepper Schwartz and James Whiter, and gathered survey data from volunteers in 23 countries, answering more than 1,300 questions. The finding the Gottmans emphasize is a negative one. What happened once couples were in bed had very little to do with how satisfied they were with their sex lives. The 13 habits Northrup, Schwartz, and Witter identified among sexually satisfied couples are overwhelmingly extra bedroom, saying "I love you" daily and meaning it, kissing passionately for no reason, giving compliments and surprise romantic gifts, knowing what turns a partner on and off, being physically affectionate in public, continuing to play and have fun, cuddling often, treating sex as a priority rather than the last item on a to-do list, staying good friends, being able to talk comfortably about their sex life, having weekly romantic dates, taking romantic vacations, and being mindful about turning toward. The Gottmans point out that most of the list is already what the preceding 5 days have been teaching. The chapter's physiological argument is built on oxytocin, released by physical intimacy, which the authors describe as lowering blood pressure, washing away stress, and reducing risk of heart disease, making touch a matter of physical health and longevity, not merely relationship maintenance. The evidence for necessity is stark. An isolated human infant has a greater chance of dying, even when given all the food and water she needs. The pandemic supplied a natural experiment in adults, with people quarantining alone developing what researchers call touch deprivation, which Tiffany Field links strongly to anxiety and depression, and what other studies call touch starvation. The mechanism runs opposite to oxytocin's rest and repair state. Stress and anxiety rise, cortisol is overproduced, and the body shifts into fight or flight, with elevated heart rate and blood pressure and shallow breathing, eventually interfering with digestion and suppressing immune function. Field, who heads the Touch Research Institute at the University of Miami and has called touch the mother of all senses, supplies the chapter's most affecting evidence, and it is autobiographical. As a graduate student in the mid-1970s, she gave birth a month early, at 30 weeks, into a medical consensus that premature infants should not be touched because the infection risk was too high. Babies were kept in incubators without parental contact. Field believed touch would help her daughter thrive, persuaded the hospital staff to let her massage the baby, and observed that the infant became calmer and ate more. She went on to develop an incubator, permitting parental touch while maintaining antiseptic isolation, and her study found that touched premature infants thrived, gained weight faster, and were discharged nearly a full week earlier. The Gottmans' own adult study on the same theme concerns couples expecting a first child. 15 minutes of daily touch, a neck or shoulder massage for the pregnant woman, produced signs of postpartum depression in 22% of new mothers. In the group that did not practice touch, incidence was 66%. Having established the case for touch, the chapter catalogues the obstacles. Culture is the first, and the evidence is Sidney Gerard's coffeehouse study from the 1960s, in which he traveled the world, sat in coffee shops, and counted how many times couples touched each other in an hour. Any touch. Hands, an arm, a back, hair, knees leaning together. In Paris, the count was 110 times an hour. In Gainesville, Florida, it was twice. In London, it was 0. Gerard concluded that certain cultures carry a touch taboo. Family is the smaller pond inside that ocean. A partner raised in a low-touch or no-touch household may find touch uncomfortable or anxiety-provoking, and where there is a history of abuse, even kind and loving touch can trigger fear, especially when it is quick, rough, or by surprise. The authors name the opposite condition too, skin hunger, an acute need for more touch than one is receiving. On sex differences, they are careful. Research indicates men on average think about sex twice as often as women in a typical day. But they immediately note that plenty of heterosexual couples reverse the pattern, and they respond to women worried about declining libido with a flat reassurance that nothing is wrong. They offer a bleak evolutionary aside. In prehistoric times, life expectancy was roughly 40, and women did not require a sex drive later in life because there was no later, before making the operative point. For many men, though not all, desire leads to contact. For many women, again not all, contact leads to desire. Non-sexual touch is therefore not a lesser substitute, but frequently the entrance. The authors are explicit that this is not licensed to manipulate a partner toward sex, and that physical intimacy does not need to lead anywhere to be worthwhile. Erasing the expectation that it will is itself one of the best things a couple can do. Touch is its own nutrient. Because so much of this is invisible from the outside, the authors insist that touch must be discussed rather than guessed at. Their questions are simple and specific. What kinds of touch do you most like? What do you dislike? When is your favorite time to be touched or hugged? Are there times you do not want to be touched? Are there places you prefer to be touched? Their two headline instructions to couples like Grace and Andrew are to talk about it, and not to fixate on the bedroom. The chapter's most quoted experiment belongs to James Cone. A woman was placed in an fMRI tube with an electrode on a big toe and shown either a green circle or a red X, with the red X carrying a 1 in 4 chance of a mild shock, unpleasant rather than painful. Anticipation of the shock reliably lit up her amygdalae. Cohen then compared 3 conditions: her husband holding her hand beside the tube, a stranger holding her hand, and no one holding her hand. With a stranger or with no one, the fear response fired as before. With her husband holding her hand, it shut down completely. She saw the red X, and the anticipatory fear simply did not appear. Cohen replicated the result with same-sex couples before the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage, asking participants whether they considered themselves married and committed. Those who said yes showed the reduced fear response, which the authors summarize as commitment functioning like protective armor. The complementary work is Paul Zaks, who calls oxytocin the molecule of trust. In his trust game, participants were given money and could give it away, which tripled the amount, but only if they trusted the recipient to return a share. People typically gave away half and kept half. A small dose of oxytocin administered nasally made them give away more and trust more immediately. The authors do not leave the finding uncomplicated. Oxytocin is also sometimes called the hormone of bad judgment, and in another study, people under its influence made poor investment decisions, trusting an obvious conman. Their conclusion is that it is powerful and should be aimed at one's partner. Zach's practical discovery, which supplies the chapter's most concrete instruction, is that a 20-second hug works about as well as a synthetic nasal spray. Hence the 2 numbers the book is best known for: hug for 20 seconds, because that is how long oxytocin takes to metabolize in the bloodstream, and kiss for 6 seconds, for which the authors admit the only justification is intuition, and that it feels good. Grace and Andrew's prescription became mini touches: quick contact in passing, a kiss, a squeeze of the shoulder, a hug. The specific ritual they built was for homecoming. Whoever arrived second threw open the door and announced, "I'm here," and the other came to meet them with a hug and a kiss. The children adopted it immediately and loudly. Other rituals followed, including a morning goodbye kiss even when Andrew left before Grace woke, supported by a German study reported in The Science of Kissing, finding that men who kiss their wives goodbye in the morning live 5 years longer than men who do not. A study of 184 couples on non-sexual intimate touch produced the chapter's most forgiving finding. People varied enormously in how much touch they wanted and how much anxiety they felt about not getting it. But relationships improved when a person could see their partner making the effort, whether or not the quantity ever matched the desire. The Love Lab's own 3,000 couples produced the closing image. The ones still happily together 6 years on were the ones who touched affectionately while cooking and cleaning and discussing the weather, who held hands, who touched encouragingly even while working through conflict, and who leaned toward rather than away, such that lines drawn down from the crowns of their heads would always be converging, like two descending halves of a drawbridge about to meet. Day 7. Declare a date night. The final day names something the authors think is under-discussed: loneliness inside a marriage. Couples can spend decades together, raise children, and occupy the same rooms while living parallel, rather than shared lives, and can sit beside the person they love and feel entirely alone. The evidence is the Sloan Center study at UCLA, launched in 2002, which the authors describe as unlike anything attempted before. Social scientists moved into the homes of dual-career families with children and recorded every waking moment for a week. Handheld cameras following people room to room, capturing every interaction, conversation, and sigh. The authors draw an explicit contrast with their own method. In the Love Lab, the cameras were unobtrusive, and couples could feel alone together, whereas here, a living person stood in the room zooming in while an argument was hashed out. Participants nonetheless reported forgetting the observers were present, and the resulting 1,540 hours of videotape are presented as an accurate portrait of ordinary domestic life. The study ran in middle-class West Los Angeles neighborhoods with 32 families, capturing the city's diversity: Black, Latino, Asian, and mixed-race families, along with several same-sex couples. Two numbers emerged. Husbands and wives were alone together in the same room only 10% of the time. More striking, the average amount of time couples spent in conversation with each other was 35 minutes per week, and most of that concerned logistics, errands, bills, and the division of tasks. Almost none of it touched the subjects the authors consider less urgent, but more important. How was your day? How is your job going? Do you feel like you're doing too much? What's on your mind? If the family ate together, the parents talked to the children rather than to each other, which the authors are careful to call valuable in its own right, while insisting it is not the same as connecting as a couple. Their generalization is that this happens in every configuration: one parent home and one working, both working, neither working, and to childless couples equally, and their conclusion is that the relationship at the center of everything is the thing that gets neglected. The clinical scale of the fun deficit comes from the author's survey of more than 40,000 couples across different sexual orientations who were about to begin therapy. 80% reported that fun had come to die in their relationship. They pair this with the work of Michelle Weiner Davis on what she calls the sex-starved marriage, noting that couples entering counseling rarely present their sex life as the primary complaint. They name the division of household labor, finances, or parenting differences, before it becomes clear they have lost touch physically, emotionally, and intellectually. The Gottmans then offer their own theory about why sex therapy alone frequently fails. It treats a surface problem. What is missing is not only sexuality, but sensuality, adventure, and fun. Their diagnosis is cultural, that adulting has come to mean shutting down the play, imagination, and creativity of childhood as the price of being taken seriously, when in fact a successful relationship is built on precisely those capacities, as is our best art and thinking. A devitalized couple has closed itself to all forms of openness at once, and the authors are blunt that with such couples every other strategy goes nowhere. They are unresponsive to touch, to open-ended questions, to romantic overtures, and have even stopped enjoying good food. The authors then place themselves in the diagnosis. At one stretch, John was teaching full-time, writing grants and publishing, while Julie was in 40 hours a week of patient sessions, plus paperwork, preparation and research. Both were working at least 60-hour weeks. They were snappy and short with each other and had stopped dating entirely. After a fight about nothing, which they recognized was really about distance and the absence of touch, they got out their calendars, found nothing but conflicts, and John said they should simply go out that night. They cleared the evening, dressed as if for a party, and went to the Hotel Sorrento in downtown Seattle. A red brick hotel standing since 1909 with the faded luxury of that era. They were not guests. They walked in confidently, commandeered a velvet couch by the fireplace, ordered one drink each, and talked for hours while other guests came and went. Nobody noticed or removed them. The authors describe it as cheap, slightly illicit, thrilling, and immediately transformative. Sitting by that fire had reignited their own. The next morning's conversation about logistics was identical in content and entirely different in feeling. They made date night weekly and non-negotiable, and it held. The chapter's practical argument is about widening the definition. A date is about expanding love maps, asking open-ended questions and following them, being physically close, and, most importantly, adventure. Whether literal, like sneaking into a grand hotel, or metaphorical, like sitting on a porch watching the sunset and seeing where the conversation goes. The examples the authors have collected are inventive. One couple met at a bar after work in character, improvising a scenario over cocktails. Once he was KGB, and she was CIA, each trying to recruit the other, changing characters monthly as a way of playing with identity and desire, and finding, as the authors put it, nuggets of truth in the identities they briefly slipped on. Another walked to a nearby amusement park, rode the Ferris wheel and talked while the lit wheel paused them at the top above the whole town, discussing tomorrow, the weekend, and the next 5 years. An Orcas Island couple, whose small house was routinely overrun by teenagers, filled a backpack with candles, wine, cheese, and apples, and walked to a long dock jutting into the channel, staying until it grew cold and the candles blew out. The author's own family version was to drive to the Seattle ferry dock without consulting the schedule, board whatever boat was next, and end up wherever it went. Once an island town of wineries and bookshops where they ate fudge out of the bag, once an empty, windy beach where they hunted beach glass and shouted over the wind. Vanessa and Carlos illustrate the discipline the authors are actually asking for. She is a freelance graphic artist who frequently worked into the small hours to make deadlines. He is a middle school math teacher who rose at 5 to grade tests. Their pandemic date night was the backyard fire pit, marshmallows and s'mores with their 3 children early, then stoking the fire, putting the baby down, launching the older 2 into the bedtime routine, and returning to sit outside with no phones and only the crackle of wood. It never went smoothly. Heads out the window, whisper screaming about toothpaste or who hit whom, the baby waking rain, through which they sat anyway with their hoods up, laughing. Vanessa's account of the cost is the most honest line in the chapter. She missed a couple of deadlines, it was stressful, she took some blowback at work, and it was worth it. Because something had to give, and she decided it was not going to be her marriage. The chapter closes by hardening the commitment. Something will always try to take date night, a deadline, a babysitter problem, bone-tired exhaustion. So the authors instruct the reader to picture them writing a prescription, signed and dated, to be urgently filled, and to get comfortable saying no to other demands on that time. A firm commitment functions as a fortress against the world's constant claims, including the genuinely worthwhile ones of career and parenting. The time is not extra, not a bonus, not a reward, it is an investment, and the fact that it is fun does not make it frivolous, because the fun is the mechanism by which it works. Their ground rules are correspondingly specific. No screens, no phones, no Netflix. Don't drink to the point of not being yourself. Make sure both are genuinely on board. Don't assume it ends in sex, because that is too much pressure. Be willing to let one person vent if they need to. Keep it to the 2 of you rather than making it a social engagement. Do it even if you are nervous because you have not really talked in a week or a year or a decade. and open with questions that go somewhere. What's on your mind? What are you happy about lately? What was your low point this week? What are you longing for? Conclusion: renewing your prescription. The conclusion works by contrast. Two couples at opposite ends of a lifespan, demonstrating that the same practices operate at both. Ty and Ollie are in their early 20s and 2 years in, sharing a small London flat. Ty from California, Ollie from Nigeria by way of London. And their relationship was less than a year old when the pandemic closed the world around them. What they discovered first was a mismatch of conflict styles. Ty's instinct was to avoid confrontation, bottle things up, and hold a grudge. Ollie's was to chase him down and talk it out immediately, which Ty describes as neutralizing the fight so that it lost its power, a pattern he had never experienced before. Their schedules do not cooperate. Ty works California hours, Ollie London hours, so they stay up late and make their own schedule, chatting and playing video games and talking about the future while most people sleep. Midday they use what amounts to micro-connection, a long hug or a 30-second lie-down between Zoom calls, spooning for under a minute, which Ty likens to supercharging a battery. Their harder work concerned autonomy. Ty describes fantasizing at his desk about moving to Barcelona alone, renting a sunny apartment, walking cobblestone streets, being a young man alone in a city, the kind of thought his previous partners had received badly enough that he had learned not to raise it. He raised it with Ollie anyway, unwilling to leave things lurking, and asked directly whether Ollie would be all right with him going for a month. Ollie's answer was, of course, if that is what you need. Ty's reflection afterward is the point of the passage. There will always be a part of him that craves the individualized experience, and because Ollie made room for it and because they could discuss it openly, he discovered that being in a relationship did not have to prevent him from doing what he wanted. He could do it while having a home base. Their anniversary in lockdown, when the restaurant and cocktails were impossible, consisted of Ollie shouting at Ty not to come out of the kitchen while he pushed the couches together, stacked cushions, draped the whole soft castle in blankets, and set up a picnic inside with wine and good glasses. What the pair identify as the thing that keeps them friends and lovers is that they thank each other all day long for everything, large or small. For listening to a vent, for a cup of coffee made alongside one's own, and mean it every time. Matt and Adrienne have been married 44 years, with 2 children and 3 grandchildren, and Adrienne says she never intended to marry or have children at all. It was the 1970s. Nobody she knew was getting married, and it was not cool. She had watched her mother stay home with 5 children and knew that none of the women of that generation had careers. She met Matt in 1974 at the college newspaper, where he was photo editor and she laid out copy in the composing room. He asked her out repeatedly and she always declined, until a Halloween party where he appeared as a mad scientist with wild hair and a mischievous grin. She was standing above him on the stairs while he talked to costumed partygoers, drinking keg beer from solo cups, and she kicked off a shoe, reached her foot down, and ran her toes through his hair. Quite a moment, she says. He proposed 2 years later. She said no, then eventually yes. Mostly to make him happy, reasoning that she could always get a divorce. They married at City Hall at 9 in the morning with their parents as witnesses, he in a navy cardigan, she in a blouse and skirt. No rings. The years that followed are presented without romanticism. Adrienne, a graphic artist, gave up the work when the children arrived because parenting an infant while working proved impossible alongside Matt's 4-hour round-trip commute. They moved repeatedly for his jobs. She felt she was giving up too much and largely did not say so. Her own retrospective account is that she never told him how little support she was getting and simply stewed silently for years. Matt, for his part, was struggling to establish himself in a cutthroat corporate environment, put his head down and charged, lay awake over the responsibility of providing, and likewise shared none of it at the time. He has since moved into public service work he finds more fulfilling. She has returned to graphic design through a freelance business. Both say the relationship is better than it has ever been, and both are explicit that it did not happen overnight. It came gradually from small course corrections, letting little things go, raising needs and issues as they arose instead of stewing, and prioritizing time together. They now go on adventures nearly every weekend, a hike, a drive to a sculpture park, a picnic in the snow, a bike ride on a rail trail, to a bookstore she loves with a stop at his favorite vintage diner on the way home. And every anniversary they carry a bottle of champagne into the woods, find a place with a view, and drink a toast, even in the rain. Their own metaphor is two sets of train tracks, sometimes running closely in tandem, sometimes split apart and parallel, then intersecting again. There was no revelation that saved them. There was the daily work of deciding, moment to moment, that the marriage was worth it and choosing it again. What they have gained late is the ability to talk about the earlier years honestly. Each now holds a far more accurate picture of what those hard years were like for the other, and can see how thoroughly they shut each other out, and how much that compounded the difficulty. Adrian's summary of 44 years is the book's closing wisdom. You always have to be re-meeting each other, because you are not the same person at 60 that you were at 20. Losing track of each other is inevitable. The question is whether you make the effort to get to know each other again, whether you stay curious, and whether you can remain friends. That, she says, is what romance actually is. Friendship. The book then reviews the week and asks for 2 commitments. The reader is asked to keep a short daily journal, on the grounds that some practices land immediately while others need time, and that written observation is the only way to see which ones produce change over weeks rather than days. And the reader is asked to hold a weekly State of the Union meeting for the next month. A short conversation on a shared day off, in which the only permitted subject is what went right, plus 3 specific things each appreciated about the other that week. The author's reasoning is that every ordinary day supplies abundant opportunity to notice what is undone and imperfect, and this meeting exists to supply the counterweight. They also point readers to the free Gottman Card Decks app, built on the physical decks used in their Art and Science of Love workshops, with decks including date questions, open-ended questions, and expressing needs, and they recommend their own 8 dates as the natural next book. The geometric image the authors leave the reader with is John's phrase, convergent accelerating trajectories. 2 lines beginning far apart, changing angle by a fraction of a degree, and therefore inevitably meeting. Translated, it is greater change over time through small things often. The mud fight and the rock in the river restated as mathematics. Closing. What the reader carries away from the love prescription is a reordering of what counts as important. The book's most valuable move is not any single exercise, but its insistence that the load-bearing structure of a relationship is not the dramatic conversation, the annual vacation, or the resolution of the standing dispute, but the accumulated texture of ordinary days. Whether you looked up from the email, whether you said thank you for the coffee, whether you asked a question you did not already know the answer to. That texture is made of choices small enough to seem beneath notice, which is precisely why they go unmade. Naming them, counting them, and prescribing them is a real service, and the Gottman's evidentiary base, the coded footage, the 6-year follow-ups, the 33% against the 86, gives the advice a weight that ordinary relationship writing cannot claim. The book is also honest about the limits of what it is doing, though the reader has to notice it. The authors concede that most of what couples fight about cannot be solved. That intention counts for nothing next to impact, and that 50 years of measurement produced not a theory of love, but a set of habits. That last point is worth dwelling on, because it is where the book is most and least satisfying. Measurement can establish that turning toward predicts endurance. It cannot say why a person should keep turning toward on the day it costs something, or what obligates 2 people to each other once the feeling has thinned. The Gottman's answer, offered near the end, is that good relationships lengthen your life, which is true, and which is a smaller reason than the practice requires. The couples in these pages who actually endure are not doing cost-benefit analysis on their immune systems. Matt and Adrian stayed married through years neither of them enjoyed because they kept choosing it, and Adrian's own account of what that produced is not longevity but friendship. That is a vow doing the work the data cannot do, and it is the quiet condition underneath every exercise in this book. Fidelity is what makes the small things worth accumulating. Without it, they are merely pleasant. The habits are real, and they work best for people who have already decided they are not leaving. Read the full book. It is short, it is generous, and the 7 days are genuinely worth doing.